Noswaith dda. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Assembly. I'm Claire Clancy. I'm Chief Executive and Clerk of the Assembly. Our Llywydd, Ellen Jones, was due to open this event and was really looking forward to doing so and to welcoming you here this evening. But unfortunately, Assembly business is carrying on, so she's over in the Senedd chairing the plenary session right now. So she can't be released until she's finished her work over there. And I know she's disappointed not to be here to open this. So on behalf of her, I would like to welcome you all here this evening for this absolutely fascinating and important lecture. To complement tonight's lecture and to mark the centenary of the 1914 Christmas Truce, we're also hosting an exhibition on the Truce from the Royal Welch Fusiliers Museum. And I'd encourage you all to go upstairs afterwards, if you haven't already done so, to our Futures Gallery and have a look at the exhibition before you go this evening. Tonight's lecture forms part of a wider programme of events that the Assembly is delivering over the four-year commemorative period. We've been working with Wales Remembers and Wales for Peace to deliver a conference for young people and the annual 2-minute silence, which is held on Armistice Day. And I'd like to take this opportunity to invite all of you who want to join us in the Senedd on Friday morning to remember those who have served and died for us and for our freedom. Next year, we're thrilled that the Senedd will host the Weeping Willow. It's an art installation of the ceramic poppies that remembers the life of British and colonial soldiers who lost their lives during the First World War. This iconic structure, I'm sure you've all seen it, was initially conceived as the key dramatic sculpture in the installation Blood-Swept Lands and Seas of Red at the Tower of London in 2014. And in its original setting, it really captured the imagination of people and was visited by over 5 million people. So we hope that this success will certainly be replicated when the poppies come and join us here at the Senedd next year. Finally, could I thank Lieutenant General Jonathan Riley for agreeing to deliver this evening's commemorative lecture. It is a real privilege to have an expert of his standing here to speak to us this evening. Lieutenant General.
Thank you. Well, thank you, ma'am, and thank you, all of you, for turning out on such a dismal evening. I'll hope to warm your hearts a bit with this story. A story which begins with the summer crisis of 1914, on the 28th of June, with the assassination of the Austro-Hungarian heir Franz Ferdinand, and which approached its climax on the 2nd of August, the day on which the German government sent an ultimatum to Belgium demanding passage for its troops through Belgian territory in order to attack France. On the 3rd, the Belgian government refused the German demands, and Britain issued a guarantee of armed support to Belgium should Germany violate Belgian neutrality in support of its position as a guarantor of Belgium's neutrality under the Treaty of London of 1839 that established the country. Germany immediately declared war on France, and the British government ordered general mobilization. On the 4th of August, German troops crossed the Belgian frontier and attacked the fortress of Liège. In response, the British government sent an ultimatum to Germany demanding the withdrawal of German troops from neutral Belgium, which, if it had not been accepted by 11 p.m. London time, meant war. No such undertaking was received, and consequently, Britain was at war with Germany. Britain had intended to stay out of any European war if at all possible, even though a well-developed mobilization and deployment plan existed, which had been worked out by the General Staff as relations with France, the old enemy, had warmed. Under these Anglo-German plans, Britain, for the first time in a century, committed itself to a continental rather than a wholly maritime strategy in Europe. British plans in outline involved the mobilization and deployment of a force of up to 6 infantry divisions in 3 corps and a cavalry division. Not much when compared with the 34 army corps of the German army in the west. The British were to fall in on the left flank of the French armies, acting as a small, mobile and strategically decisive balancing force, as the staff plan put it, to make up for the inadequacy of the French armies for their great task of defending the entire French frontier. Among the many regiments and battalions that comprised the British Expeditionary Force were the 2 regular battalions of Wales's oldest regiment, the Royal Welch Fusiliers. In 1914, the regiment recruited throughout Wales, in the border counties of England, in Ireland, in Birmingham, and in London. Its order of battle included 2 regular battalions, the 1st and 2nd, a special reserve, the 3rd, based in Wrexham, which is, and the depot there is shown on the slide, and 4 territorial force battalions spread around Flintshire, Denbighshire, Carnarvonshire, Anglesey, Merioneth, Montgomeryshire, and the northern part of Cardigan. All these battalions were immediately warmed for mobilisation. Mobilisation, the process that brings an army from its peacetime state to a war footing. It included raising regular army units from peacetime strength to their war establishment using reservists. And one such reservist is shown on the slide in the lower part there. Private Frank Richards, who will come into our story later on. He'd been born near Newport, Monmouthshire in 1883 and joined up in 1901. He went with the 2nd Battalion to India in 1902, and there he stayed for the rest of his service until 1909. In 1914, he was recalled to the regimental depot at Wrexham and went back to his old battalion. In later life, he wrote these 2 books, Old Soldier Saab and Old Soldiers Never Die, with the help of Robert Graves. And these 2 books, surprisingly enough, or perhaps not so, are still in print, telling the story of his military service. Once the decision had been taken to go to war, the military plan swung into action. With the Channel secured by the Royal Navy, the Expeditionary Force crossed with barely a hitch and moved forward to its concentration area between Avesnes and Le Cateau. Contact was made with the advancing Germans at the battles of Mons and Le Cateau on the 26th of August, when the strength of the German army, especially in artillery, was rudely realised. There followed the 16-day withdrawal to the Marne, and it was now that the flaw in the Germans' plan, their compromise of the original invasion scheme in order to cope with a simultaneous war with Russia by withdrawing divisions from the west to send to the east, became apparent. As the German right wing swung south and east towards Paris, a gap opened. The Germans had exposed their right flank, and once this was realised, the French armies, with the British largely in support, launched the great counterattack of the Marne in early September. The Germans, in their turn, were now pushed back, and their chance to win the war in a month was gone. But they withdrew in good order to the line of the River Ain, and here, between the 12th and the 15th of September, the line solidified. Then began what became known as the Race for the Sea, as the 2 sides tried to outflank each other to the west. By the time that winter weather set in November, the line was continuous from the Channel to the Swiss frontier, and there it stayed with only limited changes until March 1918. As Christmas approached, there were moves towards some sort of truce or armistice. Pope Benedict XV proposed the idea in early December, and the Germans accepted almost at once, but with the proviso that so too did everyone else. That, however, was a forlorn hope. The Muslim Turks had no interest in such an idea. The Russians and Serbs, being Orthodox, celebrated Christmas 11 days later and were also hostile to anything coming from Rome. The French and Belgians, after seeing their country invaded, were in no mood to talk of goodwill. Similar proposals from the USA also got nowhere. But in all the armies, there were preparations for the troops' Christmas, some of which I'll talk about in just a few minutes. Well, what about the regiment? The 1st Battalion of the regiment had landed, having come from Malta on the 7th of October at Zeebrugge, with a strength of just over 1,000 men, and it joined the 7th Division. The 2nd Battalion had already landed at Rouen on the 11th of August, with a strength just under 1,000 men. It had just come back from Karachi, having been stationed in India for nearly 18 years. The 2 battalions had in fact met in Malta during the 2nd Battalion's homeward voyage on the 1st of March 1914 and celebrated St. David's Day for the first time in the entire history of the regiment. This picture of the 2 officers' messes shows 37 men, of whom by Christmas half were dead, wounded, missing or captured. Another 7 were killed by 1918, so a third of those in this picture did not survive the war, and of those who did, only 2 escaped unwounded. This picture shows those who had embarked with the 2nd Battalion for France in 1914 and were still upright at the end of the war. The two battalions had a very different experience of war during the late summer and early autumn of 1914. The 2nd Battalion was originally designated as Line of Communication Troops, but then moved to 19 Independent Infantry Brigade. It had some contact with the Germans at Locato, but very few losses. It then took part in the retreat from Mons. Its first real losses, 1 officer and 12 men, were taken on the Marne. The battalion was again positioned in a quiet part of the line during the Battle of the Aisne. And on the 12th of October, its brigade was placed under command of the 6th Infantry Division and ordered to occupy the heights north of Lille. And it began entrenching there, as in these photographs, 10 days later at the Ferme de la Cordonnière. It then redeployed into what one diarist described as rotten trenches to the east of Houplines, the district of Armentières. On the 25th of November, it was ordered into the line at the village of Freilingen on the French-Belgian border, and there it stayed for the next month. Matters were much worse for the 1st Battalion, seen here in this picture near Mons in late August, than for the 2nd. The battalion had been heavily engaged in the First Battle of Ypres, losing 177 men in a single day. By the 19th of October, it was no more than 400 strong, and on the 20th, it was all but annihilated by a German attack near the village of Zandvoorde. It was reduced to only 90 all ranks. Its commanding officer, Hal Cadogan, was amongst those killed. And a day later, only 1 officer, a quartermaster sergeant, and 30 men were still alive and unwounded. This picture here shows 29 officers who were with the battalion on embarkation. By Christmas, only 1 was alive and unwounded. 11 were dead, 6 wounded, 7 wounded and captured, and 3 missing. Now, the reason I raised this business of the different experiences of the two battalions, because I think one factor in explaining how and why truces happened in the way that they did was the previous experience of units and how well or ill disposed they were for the Germans. It was as well that the Saxons at Freilingen encountered 2 RWF in the line, a battalion that had suffered very little and therefore had no personal animosity to their enemy. Had it been the 1st Battalion, things would have been rather different. I think we can say with confidence that any attempt by Germans to make a truce with 1 RWF would have been met with 5 rounds rapid fire. There were certainly plenty of other units that felt that way. Well, what about the German side? On the 9th of August, the 133rd Regiment, 9th Royal Saxon Infantry, which was to meet the Royal Welch Fusiliers in no man's land at Christmas, transferred from Zwickau in southern Germany to the Luxembourg border, and from there advanced to the French frontier. It crossed the Maas on the 22nd of October, made contact with the enemy 2 days later, crossed the Aisne on the 1st and 2nd of September, and took part in the Battle of the Marne. From the 11th, they began to withdraw to the east of Châlons, and following the fall of Lille in mid-October, they started digging into the south of this industrial town. Their losses, too, had been severe. From its 84 officers and 3,200 men on the day of its mobilization, by the 8th of December, 37 officers and just over 1,000 men were dead or wounded. On the 8th of December, the King of Saxony visited his troops, and here he is doing it, welcomed delegations from all battalions. But according to the regimental report, all was quiet in the line between the 22nd and the 28th of December, when the 133rd was in the line around the village of Freilingen. The captain commanding the machine gun company of the 2nd Silesian Jaeger Battalion, which was attached to the Saxons, was this chap, Freiherr or Baron Friedrich Karl Maximilian von Zinner. Von Zinner had been born on the 21st of August 1875 at Saarbrücken and commissioned in 1895. He'd become a machine gun specialist in 1901. He later commanded a battalion, survived the war, and retired as a colonel. On Christmas Eve, von Zinner and his men were in the line in front of the brewery on the south side of Freilingen and right next to the River Lys. Opposite them, commanding A Company of the 2nd Royal Welch Fusiliers, was Captain Clifton Inglis Stockwell, who'd been born on the 27th of September 1879 and commissioned in 1899. He was, as luck would have it, a fluent German speaker. He later commanded the 1st Battalion of the Royal Welsh and was given the nickname Buffalo Bill, as reported by Robert Graves, and nicknamed as Kinjack in Siegfried Sassoon's Memoirs of an Infantry Officer. He ended the war as a brigadier general, a tough disciplinarian and a thoroughgoing fighting soldier. Two very different people, two very different units, meeting through the chances of war at the village of Freilingen. Well, what about this village? And here's some contemporary imagery from the locals. On the 23rd of February 1915, the principal of the Albertinum Secondary School at Freiburg in Germany, senior teacher Dr. Otto Schmidt, got an order from the King of Saxony, which must have caused him some consternation, sending him to the Ministry of Culture, where he was told to go to the Western Front and record the part that Saxon troops were playing in the war for posterity. And it's through the record of his journey in March and April 15 that we are fortunate to have a contemporary impression of what the Saxon infantry were doing at Freilingen. And he said this about the position around the village. The beautiful old church in the middle of the town is a view of terrible destruction. Only the Gothic outer wall and a deplorable stump of the tower still stand. We enter a big ruin of a former brewery. Carefully we climb the stairs and look through a big hole created by a shell, unseen from the enemy, to the west. There runs the River Lys right at the bottom of our feet, at the time not wider than the Mulde at Zwickau, but in times of flooding a couple of 100 meters wide, and then she fills up every trench and dugout in her reach with her mud-green water. The iron bridge, which once crossed the river, lies shattered by shells, a bent entanglement in the water, but next to it our pioneers had laid a wooden path. A couple of 100 meters away on the western bank, I can see the long stretched line of the English trenches. Some more detail comes from a soldier, Corporal, later Lieutenant Herbert Yarn, then aged 25. He too survived the war. After the heavily fortified brewery and adjacent buildings had been taken and were in German hands, can't help noticing that the Germans took the brewery, our position was a particularly bad one because of the terrain in front of us, which was slowly inclining towards the enemy and was difficult to overlook. The distance from the enemy is now only 80 meters on the right flank. Well, here at Freilingen, the men of both sides would have to spend Christmas in the cold and wet of the trenches along the River Lys. But the administrative organisation of both armies worked hard to get special hot food and a ration of rum up to the line. Both sides, too, had distinctive Christmas presents for their soldiers. All British soldiers were sent Princess Mary's gift box. And here's my grandfather's example of it, which you're welcome to have a look at. I'm sure many of you have them as well. It came into existence as a reminder of Queen Victoria's tin box, which was a box with chocolates given to the troops in the South African War. Princess Mary was the third child and only daughter of King George V and Queen Mary, and she launched the Princess Mary Fund to provide comforts for the troops. By late November 1914, this had a value of £100,000. In terms of purchasing power, about 8 million quid today. And from this, nearly 430,000 brass boxes were purchased and divided into various classes, packed with cigarettes, or a pipe, or an ounce of tobacco, a tinder lighter, or matches, in packets like this. For non-smokers, the box could hold acid drops. For officers, there was a khaki writing case and a sterling silver pen in a 303 cartridge. I remember that pen in that box, and I've always been told to stop playing with it, boy, but I'm afraid I think I lost it. The Indian colonial troops were given sugar candy and a small tin box with spices, and nurses were given chocolate. On the German side, their Christmas presents became known as gifts of love. From the Kaiser, each soldier received a cigar case with the inscription Christmas in the Field, 1914. The Crown Prince, as a reminder of the present from the King in the War of 1870, gave the soldiers of his Fifth Army a pipe showing his picture. Saxony planned to have one parcel for every 50 men, containing 4 or 5 presents for every soldier. And these could be anything: clothing, food, luxuries, toiletries, articles for personal use, organised by the German Red Cross. The schools of Leipzig, for example, collected 13,000 parcels, those of Chemnitz 3,000. Leipzig alone collected gifts worth 400,000 marks in the city's main department store. And all of this lot, together with the King's Christmas castles, required 23 railway wagons to move them to Lille for the troops in early December. The war diary of the Second Royal Welch Fusiliers reported the days leading up to Christmas and the surprising events of the morning of the 25th of December, a subject on which the German regimental history was, by contrast, completely silent. We have a lot more detail from letters home by Lieutenant Richardson, Private John Morris, and above all, the personal diary and a long letter by Stockwell, which I'll use to tell you what happened. On the 24th of December, he wrote, "All was very quiet on the front. A pheasant in no man's land was shot through the head and brought in. It was probably a refugee from Plug Street Wood and raised by Hennessy of Brandy Flame." On the 25th of December, our pioneer sergeant, Nobby Hall, made a screen and painted on it a Merry Christmas, which we hoisted on Christmas morning. No shots were fired. On the left, we could see our fellows carrying their breakfast into the open, and everything was quiet. Both sides got a bit venturesome and looked over the top. Then a German started to walk down the towpath towards our lines, and Ike Sawyer went to meet him. The German handed over a box of cigars. Later, the Germans came boldly out of their trenches, but our men were forbidden to leave theirs, so they threw out tins of bully beef and plum and apple jam, etc., with plenty of sympathy in the shape of, "Here you are, you poor hungry bastards," and other such endearments. I ran out into the trench and found that the men were holding their rifles at ready on the parapet and that the Saxons were shouting, "Don't shoot, we don't want to fight today, we'll send you some beer." And there's the brewery. A cask was hoisted onto the parapet and 3 men started to roll it into the middle of no man's land. A lot more Saxons then appeared without arms. Things were getting a bit thick. My men were getting excited and the Saxons kept shouting to them to come out. We didn't like to fire because they were all unarmed, but we had strict orders and someone might have fired. So I climbed over the parapet and shouted in my best German for the opposing captain to appear. Our men were all chattering and saying, "The captain's going to speak to them." Finally we met and formally saluted. He introduced himself as Count something or other and seemed a very decent fellow. He could not speak a word of English. He then called out his officers and formally introduced them with much clicking of heels and saluting. They were all very well turned out, while I was in a goatskin coat. And there he is in his goatskin coat, which he'd probably brought back from the northwest frontier, where I can assure you they're still being worn. One of the lieutenants could talk a few words of English, but not enough to carry on a conversation. I said to the German captain, "My orders are to keep my men in the trench and allow no armistice. Don't you think it's dangerous with all your men running about in the open like this? Someone may open fire." He called out an order and all his men went back to the parapet, leaving me and the 5 German officers and a barrel of beer in the middle of no man's land. He then said, "My orders are the same as yours, but could we not have a truce from shooting today? We don't want to shoot, do you?" I said, "No, we certainly don't want to shoot, but I have my orders to obey, to which he agreed. I then suggested that we should return to our trenches and that no one should come out of the trench. We agreed not to shoot until the following morning, when I was to signal that we were going to begin. He said, "You'd better take the beer, we have lots." So I called up the men to bring the barrel to our side. I didn't like to take their beer without giving something in exchange, and I suddenly had a brainwave. We had lots of plum puddings, so I went for one and formally presented it to him in exchange for the beer. He called out, "Waiter," and a German private whipped out 6 glasses and 2 bottles of beer, and with much bowing and saluting, we solemnly drank it, amid cheers from both sides. And then we formally saluted and returned to our lines. Private Frank Richards recorded the same events in his memoir of the war, which differ in some detail from Stockwell's account, but we should bear in mind that Stockwell was writing at the time, and Richards was being interviewed after a lapse of 50 years. Now, I do actually have a recording of Frank Richards being interviewed around about 1960, and if the technology works, we'll see if we can hear him.
This is an extract from a talk with Private Frank Richards, DCM, MM, in which he recalls the Christmas in the trenches in 1914. He enlisted in the Royal Welch Fusiliers in 1901 and served in India and Burma. He served for 8 years and then went on to the reserve. In 1914, he was recalled to the colours and served with the 2nd Battalion throughout the whole of the war. He is, of course, the author of that book, Old Soldiers Never Die.
We took over another part of the trench at Hoop Lines. We were only 80 yards from the enemy. And they had dug in front of a brewery. And we came to the conclusion they must be very good men to dig in front of a place like that. Well, it was one of the worst trenches that ever I was in my life. It was something like a coffin, and you could rise the floorboards up underneath, and there was always 3 or 4 feet of water running into it. But we had to exist in that for about a fortnight before, we got things shipshape. Then he came Christmas morning. So we stuck a board up, Merry Christmas. They also stuck one up, Merry Christmas. So we were saying, well, I don't think they'll fire today. No, I don't think they will. Then lo and behold, it was a German coming down. Our trench ran right into the river Liss. It did. And here was a German coming down the river bank with his arms up above. One of our chaps threw his equipment off. He went out to meet him. Well, they shook hands. Then we all got out. Company commander come rushing in. He was going to shoot any man that went over. Some boys from the next base said, "You were too darn late." He didn't know which was, so said it. So we all had to get out. Well, we mucked in all day, talking one thing or another. One of the Germans said to me, and in excellent English too, well, he said, "I don't know," he said. "How long do you think this damn war's going to last? I'm fed up to the neck." Oh, I said, "You were not the only one fed up." I said, "We're up to our necks in water and mud." He said, "We're the same." One of our officers said, "Well, I'm sorry I haven't got a, what do they call it, a Kodak, to take a snapshot of this." He said, "We're not allowed to carry them." The German officer said, "We're in the same boat." So he sent a couple of Germans back, and they brought some decanters, and the officers, they had a damn good drink between them. See? And our company commander gave them a plum pudding and something like that. And so it went on all day, but anyhow, it was settled between them that the truce would finish at 12 o'clock at night. Well, came 12 o'clock. Oh, and they asked our company commander if he'd mind the company having 2 barrels of beer. He said, "We got plenty there in the brewery." He said, "I can assure you, it won't make them drunk." So right-o, 2 Germans wheeled 2 barrels out into the middle of no man's land, and we rolled them back in the trench. Well, they were quite right. If you'd have drunk the whole lot yourself, you'd have burst in before ever you'd have got drunk. It was rotten clear French beer. The next day, we didn't fire. No, they didn't. And we were relieved that night.
These events were not restricted to the village of Fraylingen. A short distance up the line, Stockwell's cousin Charlie was serving with the Seaforth Highlanders. And opposite them was another battalion of the 133rd Regiment. This chap, Lieutenant Johannes Niemann, was commanding a platoon in the battalion, and he wrote an account in which he described a rough-and-tumble game of football and an exchange of gifts. Souvenirs had been exchanged between the Saxons and the Royal Welch Fusiliers as well. For example, this German forage cap was given to a Fusilier in no man's land on the 25th of December 1914. It amazingly survived the war, and we have it in our collections. By mutual consent, the truce came to an end after Boxing Day. Not every unit up and down the line had participated, and of those that had been in the line, most were immediately relieved after Christmas so that they could have a share in the comforts of the rear area. It wasn't long before accounts and photographs of the truce began to appear in the press. The London Daily News and the New York Times broke the story on New Year's Eve with the headline, "Foes in trenches swap pies for wine." Pictures followed in the Daily Sketch, the Daily Mirror, shown on the slide there, the Daily Graphic, and a steady stream of articles and features ran on until the end of January. The leader in the Daily Mirror of the 2nd of January was a fair example of the coverage, conceding that it was hard for soldiers to keep up the gospel of hate, where chance throws men into a companionship of toil and danger. Other articles appeared even in the most pro-war establishment newspapers, the ILN, the Times, Daily Telegraph, Scotsman, and the Manchester Guardian. On the German side, too, there was coverage in papers like the Berliner Tageblatt, Tägliche Rundschau, and the magazine Reklams Universum. So much for the communist and anarchist propaganda later on, suggesting that all mention of the truce was suppressed. Official reaction to the events was understandably firmly disapproving. Sir John French, shown here, wrote that when this was reported to me, I issued immediate orders to prevent any recurrence of such conduct and called the local commanders to strict account, which resulted in a good deal of trouble. French, like his counterparts in other armies, was of course charged with fighting a war, and for someone in his position, there was no room for compromise in what had already become a war from which only one side would emerge with its nationhood and integrity intact. He did, however, later reflect that I have since often thought deeply over the principle involved in the manifestation of such sentiments between hostile armies in the field. I'm not sure that had the question of the agreement upon an armistice for the day been submitted to me, I should have dissented from it. I've always attached the utmost importance to the maintenance of that chivalry in war, which has almost invariably characterized every campaign of modern times in which this country has been engaged. On the German side, too, there was a crackdown. The truce did not at all accord with the Kaiser's concept of Schrecklichkeit, frightfulness in war. However, one brigade commander, Major General Richard Carden, who's pictured on the slide, wrote in his memoirs that from a strictly warlike point of view, one can have a different opinion on such season hallowing. Seen from a human point of view, to me it is a deeply poignant expression of a common Christian feeling, which, far from being soldierly misconduct, even in this men-murdering war, lets one not forget that here as well as there stood men loving and defending their fatherland, but who also felt deeply the holy peace of Christmas in their hearts. Long after the war, in 1962 in fact, the poet and writer Robert Graves wrote a short story about the truce. Graves had served in the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the Royal Welch Fusiliers, although he did not reach France until 1915. He did, however, know Frank Richards and helped him with his books. His story portrays a fictional infantry regiment, but the events he describes are very clearly those at Fralingham, albeit an amalgam of what various units had experienced. Graves went on in his story to describe a second truce at Christmas 1915, in which the same two battalions again ended up facing each other in the line, and in which the survivors again met in no man's land. Well, 1915 had been a year of battles which A.J.P. Taylor described rather aptly as having no meaning other than as putting names on a war memorial. In France and Flanders, a much larger British army was holding a much longer stretch of the front, and it was now under the command not of Sir John French, but of Sir Douglas Haig, who'd taken command just before Christmas. Haig was determined that there would be no repetition of the events of 1914, and firm instructions were issued right down the chain of command, reminding everybody of the unauthorized truce of the previous year and ordering that nothing of the kind is to be allowed this year. On the German side, too, there were orders against fraternization and threatening the direst consequences. Any visits, agreements not to fire on each other, exchanges of news or whatever were not only strictly forbidden, but would be counted as, and I quote, verging on high treason. That is, a capital crime. So is there any truth in Graves' story? Well, actually, yes. Once we began to get into this research on the Christmas truce, an awful lot of new material has come up from family collections, and it's amazing what there is still out there uncovered about the First World War. Well, at Christmas 1915, both the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the Royal Welch Fusiliers were out of the line and resting, so thus far Graves is wrong. However, there was a Royal Welch Fusilier battalion in the line, the famous 15th Battalion, the London Welsh, in which served many of the notable literary figures of the war. Llewellyn Wyn Griffith, author of Up to Mehmet's, Wyn Weldon, father of Sir Hugh, later controller of the BBC, David Jones, whose iconic but difficult work, in parenthesis, is based on his experiences. And then there was Bill Tucker, whose book, The Lousier War, is one of the few accounts we have as life of a prisoner of war in Germany during the Great War. Tucker later worked for years on the Times and launched the Times Atlas of the World. There was also Harold Gladstone Lewis, who wrote Crow on a Barbed Wire Fence, and of course the Welsh shepherd and bard from Tras Fyneth, Ellis Evans, Hedd Wyn, who was killed in 1917. 15 RWF was a war service battalion and had arrived in France in November 1915. It had seen no serious action, just like 2 RWF the previous year, and so had no real reason to feel animosity towards the Germans on a personal level, with the exception of those who'd lost friends or brothers in their battalions. Just before Christmas, the battalion was in the line at Laventie, and that's a picture of what it was like at that time and place, which was just a few miles south of Freilingen. Here, in the cold and wet of December, the line was described in the diary of an officer of a unit then holding the sector, Captain Carlos Pip Blacker of the 1st Battalion Coldstream Guards. And he said this: "It consisted of a line of breastworks through which you could keep watch and shoot. The view through one of these loopholes was not inspiring. Across a stretch of no man's land you beheld a conspicuous line of enemy breastworks which looked pale grey in the middle distance. At the foot of both lines ran narrow belts of rusty wire which looked dark against the grey sandbags beyond. A confrontation, winding away into seeming infinity on both sides, alive with watchfulness." Now, the 15th Battalion was not as a formed unit in the line, because it was new to the theatre. Each of its companies was under instruction from a different battalion in the 2nd Guards Brigade, and it was thus spread along a lengthy stretch of the line. And this dispersion solves the puzzle that vexed me a little about why there were such differing accounts among the witnesses in 15 RWF. Llewellyn Wyn Griffith's company, C Company, was assigned to Blacker's battalion, the 1st Coldstream, and he recounted in Up to Mametz that Haig's orders had been received. "We must confine our goodwill not only to fellow Christians," he wrote, "but to Christians of allied nationality. We were to remain throughout possessed by the spirit of hate, answering any advances with lead." But on Christmas Eve, sounds of singing and merrymaking could be heard in the German trenches opposite C Company and the Coldstreamers about 100 yards away. These trenches opposite were occupied by Catholic soldiers of the 13th Bavarian Reserve Infantry Regiment. Now, these men were reservists, dragged probably unwillingly from their civilian lives. They were also more easygoing as a people than the stern Protestant Prussians. Soon shouts of "Merry Christmas, Tommy" were heard, and they were answered with shouts of "Merry Christmas, Fritz." Blacker confirms the account and says that the German breastworks were near enough for verbal exchange to be possible between the two sides. I remember someone shouting across, "What have you got for dinner today, Fritz?" The reply sounded like a fat goose. More Germans spoke English than our people spoke German. Fritz was invited to come over, but at this stage there was no movement. The company sergeant major of D Company 15 Royal Welsh was John Bradshaw, a former regular soldier. His diary also survives, and it records how the company was brought by motors from Warne to Neuve-Chapelle into the trenches with the Grenadier Guards on the 19th of December. They went into rest on the 20th and then back to the trenches on Christmas Eve. He was never able to complete his account because he died of wounds after a trench raid near Levanty the following May. Another witness to the exchanges on Christmas Day and Christmas Eve in 1915 was Private Bertie Felsted. Felsted died at the age of 106 in 2001, the oldest man then alive in Britain and the last witness of these events, and I remember talking to him about it very vividly. He remembered how the German soldiers opposite sang, in German, a hymn which shared the same tune as the Welsh hymn Al the Norse. Now, I think this is probably the German version of the hymn, "Go, my children, with my blessing, gehen meine Kinder mit meinem Segen." Their choice, probably a lucky chance, was taken as a much appreciated acknowledgement of the nationality of the opposing company, and the Royal Welch Fusiliers responded by singing "Good King Wenceslas," another detail used by Robert Graves in his account, by the way. After the night's carol singing, Felsted recalled that feelings of goodwill had so swelled up that at dawn, Bavarian and British soldiers clambered spontaneously out of their trenches, shouting such greetings as "Hello, Tommy," and "Hello, Fritz," and they shook hands in no man's land and then presented one another with gifts. German beer, sausages, and spiked helmets were given or bartered in return for bully beef, biscuits, and tunic buttons. Bradshaw's diary, rather laconically, confirms that the Germans fraternized with our troops for 15 minutes. Interestingly, John Bradshaw's personal effects, which were sent back to his family after his death, include a brass Bavarian belt buckle, which we can at least speculate he exchanged in no man's land on that Christmas Day 100 years ago. Away in C Company's area, Wyn Griffith recounted his memories of a very similar scene. "As soon as it was light, we saw hands and bottles being waved at us with encouraging shouts that we could neither understand nor misunderstand. A drunk German stumbled over his parapet and advanced through the barbed wire, followed by several others. And in a few moments there was a rush of men from both sides, carrying tins of meat, biscuits, and odd commodities for barter. This was the first time I had seen no man's land, and it was now every man's land, or nearly so. Some of our men would not go and gave terse and bitter reasons for their refusal. The officers called our men back to the line, and in a few minutes no man's land was once more empty and desolate. There'd been a feverish exchange of souvenirs, a suggestion for peace all day, and a football match in the afternoon, and a promise of no rifle fire at night. All this came to naught. Felsted, whose company was removed from Wyn Griffiths, remembered that there was a soccer match of sorts. It wasn't a game as such, he said, more a kick-around and a free-for-all. There could have been 50 on each side for all I know. I played because I really liked football. I don't know how long it lasted, maybe half an hour. David Jones was in B Company, attached to the 3rd Battalion Grenadier Guards. He recalled on Christmas morning he heard the Germans singing Christmas carols and the Cockneys in 15 Royal Welsh singing louder to drown them out. The Royal Welsh sang Casey Jones, a song he particularly liked. Recently, another previously unknown account has surfaced. It's the personal diary of Private Robert Keating, an underage private of about 16 years old. He later transferred to the Sappers and survived the war, died in 1967. In 1915, he was in A Company, assigned to the 1st Battalion Scots Guards, opposite number 246 Württemberg Reserve Infantry Regiment, again Catholic soldiers, but from the Rhineland, not Bavaria, and also reservists. Keating recorded what had happened after breakfast was over. Had breakfast, after which we shouted greetings to the Germans over the way. We shouted, "Come over." They shouted, "Come over." We stood up and saw them walking on their parapets, and then some of the jocks ran across. The officer was shouting, "Come back," but we took no heed and went on. The Germans said the war would end in a few months in our favour, and that they were absolutely fed up with everything generally. Just as we were exchanging souvenirs, the blooming artillery started, and you should have seen us run. Heaps of fellows were caught in the barbed wire, but really there was no danger to us, as the shells were dropping on the German trenches. Before leaving the Germans, one of their officers told one of ours that they would not fire another shot for 2 days if we did the same. And believe me or believe me not, in our part of the line, not a single shot was fired until we were relieved by the Irish Guards on the 26th. The personal diary of Captain Sir Ian Colquhoun, the company commander of the Scots Guards, says much the same thing. A German officer came forward and asked me for a truce for Christmas. I replied this was impossible. He asked for 3/4 of an hour to bury the dead. I agreed. The Germans then started burying their dead, and we did the same. This was finished in half an hour. Our men and the Germans then talked and exchanged cigars, cigarettes, etc. for 1/4 of an hour, and when the time was up, I blew a whistle, and we returned to the line. Further attempts at peacemaking were quickly stamped out. Wyn Griffith recalled an irate brigadier spluttering up the line, throwing out threats of court-martials and ordering an extra dose of military action that night. This was very like to have been this gentleman, Brigadier General Lord Henry Seymour, the commander of 2 Guards Brigade. Private Harold Diffie, another soldier of C Company who survived the war and also remembered the truth, said much the same in a letter. About 20 or 30 minutes after this, a staff officer with red tabs and a vociferous sergeant major appeared yelling, "You came out to fight the Huns, not to make friends with them." So our lads reluctantly returned, followed by a salvo from our 18-pounders, which ended the episode. But Keating went on to record what happened on Christmas night. We were roused up by the Scots and dragged onto the parapet, where we found all the Welsh fellows gathered. Here we were, Welsh and Scots all, clustered round the burning brazier which was placed on the outer parapet. The Germans were sending up starlights and singing. They stopped, so we cheered them, and we began singing Land of Hope and Glory, Men of Harlech, and so on. We stopped, and they cheered us. So it went on till the early hours of the morning. Firmer measures were clearly needed to enforce the approved martial spirit, and Keating's diary of Boxing Day recorded that after the morning routine, the Germans were not firing, but no one got onto the parapet, although many heads were above. Orders were issued that if any man was seen waving or heard shouting, they would be put to the wall at once, that is, shot. This order put an end to our fun. Well, Captain Colquhoun's diary recorded what happened to him on Boxing Day. I went at 10 o'clock to Winchester House to explain to a court of inquiry my conduct on Christmas Day. The brigadier, who came round my trenches 10 minutes after the truce was over, didn't mind a bit, but the Major General, Lord Cavan, is furious about it. Later, both Colquhoun and the acting commanding officer of 1 Scots Guards, Captain Miles Barn, on the left of the slide, were both tried by court-martial. Barn was acquitted of all charges. Colquhoun received a reprimand, but that was not confirmed by Sir Douglas Haig, probably because Colquhoun was related by marriage to the Prime Minister. There is, of course, a good deal of myth about the Great War, and one such myth relayed in Oh, What a Lovely War was that the ordinary soldiers of both sides longed only for a comradely peace and were excited or compelled to fight by jingoistic officers pursuing class interest. Actually, it was the officers on both sides who started several of the Christmas truces in 14 and 15. After a parley to agree the terms of ceasefires, most officers mingled with the enemy just as keenly as the men. In his memoir, Goodbye to All That, Robert Graves explained why. My battalion never allowed itself to have any political feelings about the Germans. A professional soldier's duty was to fight whomever the king ordered him to fight. The Christmas 14 fraternization, in which the battalion was among the first to participate, had the same professional simplicity. No emotional hiatus, but a commonplace of military tradition, an exchange of courtesies between opposing armies. Bruce Bairnsfather, one of the most popular soldier writers and cartoonists of the Great War, was present at the 14 truce, and he recounted that the ordinary soldier was just as hard-headed. There was, he wrote, not an atom of hate on either side during these truces. And yet, he said, on our side, not for a moment was the will to win the war and the will to beat them relaxed. It was just like the interval between the rounds of a boxing match. Siegfried Sassoon, another Royal Welsh Fusilier poet, commented, as did others, that there was often more comradely feeling between the soldiers of opposing armies who shared the same dangers and privations than between soldiers and civilians. Sassoon was in no doubt, for example, that troops would relish the opportunity to take on striking munition workers at home rather than the Germans. Even so, there was little, if any, attempt at a truce in 1916 and none whatsoever in 1917. Fellow feeling there might be, a degree of chivalry even, but by the end of the second year of war, there was not much hope of further fraternization. Even so, a century on, the truces have become a symbol of reconciliation, a glimmer of light of common humanity among a mass of darkness. In December 2014, members of the Royal Welsh and the Welsh government gathered with the local community at Freilingen and troops from the German army to mark the centenary of the truce. On the exact spot, so far as we can tell, where von Cinna and Stockwell met in 1914, their grandsons, on this slide, who had also both served in their grandfathers' regiments, met again and exchanged beer and Christmas puddings. By a strange irony, the space between the lines where they met is now a football field. Questions?